we would have come across various side effects and learned how to manage it. So this is going to be a recapitulation of most of what we know. So the outline of the talk is I'll be just touching upon the mechanism of action, the indication for amphotericin B, the pharmacokinetics, the dosing, how to administer the drug, adverse effects, specifically amphotericin nephrotoxicity, how to administer in special population, and a little bit about the lipid formulations, especially liposomal amphotericin. So amphotericin B was discovered as early as 1955. Interestingly, it was isolated from soil cultures. It is actually produced by a bacteria called Streptomycetes nodosum. So they identified two substances. One was amphotericin A and amphotericin B, and they found that amphotericin B had good antifungal activity. So it was one of the first antifungals discovered, and that is the reason there were no trials, and it was very potent in the sense it had a wide spectrum of activity, and it was considered for a long time and even today as a gold standard of treatment for life-threatening invasive fungal infections. Just to touch briefly upon the mechanism of action, a lot of study has been done as to how amphotericin acts. Now, if you can see this molecule here, this is amphotericin B. Now, this is the fungus and this is the cell wall of the fungus. We have certain compounds called as sterol compounds. In humans, we have cholesterol. In fungus, we have the ergosterol. Now, these are the ergosterol compounds. Now, amphotericin B has hydrophobic areas and hydrophilic areas. The hydrophobic area will bind to ergosterol and the hydrophilic area binds to the phospholipids. So when it binds to the ergosterol, what happens is it disrupts this lipid layer of the fungus in the cell wall. Once it disrupts, it also forms pores. Now this is called as a surface adsorption model. And through these pores, there's a loss of cations, anions, sodium, potassium, along with loss of water molecules. Now this loss disrupts the entire cell. Once this is disrupted, it leads to apoptosis and cell death. The another mechanism is that there's an extracellular sequestration of the ergosterol. You can see how on the extracellular surface itself, ergosterol is extracted from the lipid cell wall membrane. And this also leads to destabilization of the entire cell. They've also found that there is an increase in the reactive oxygen species inside the fungus, and this could be either a direct effect or it could be a secondary effect because of the pores that are formed and the loss of all the cations and the mitochondrial damage, which in turn will lead to the membrane damage, DNA damage, and the death of the cell. The other thing to remember is that now I told you that amphotericin binds to sterols. So as it binds to ergosterol, it also binds to cholesterol in the human cells, although with a very low affinity compared to ergosterol. And this is the reason why there are so many toxic side effects of amphotericin, because it can bind to human cells as well. I'm not able to move my slides. Yeah. Okay. Amphotericin B also has immunomodulatory properties, which means that it changes the immune system and enhances it to help the host elicit inflammatory response. And it does this through toll-like receptors and co-receptor CD14. And there's an increase in tumor necrosis factor, interleukins 1, 6, and 8. And this is also the reason why there are several toxic side effects, such as the infusion reactions. So this is briefly about the mechanism of action. Now coming to indications for treatment. Now the one thing to remember about amphotericin is that it is to be used in life-threatening invasive fungal infections, especially in immunocompromised and neutropenic patients. It is not to be used in non-invasive fungal infections, mild infections, or in an immunocompetent host unless it is a life-threatening infection. The reason because although it has a wide spectrum of activity, it has a very narrow therapeutic index, high incidence of adverse side effects. Plus, we have, with the advent of safer oral antifungals, and which are more potent, like the azoles and the echinocandins, such as the capsofungin, micofungin, the role of amphotericin has taken a backseat. But for two important infections, that is Cryptococcus and mucormycosis, it is still the gold standard of treatment. So the indications are cryptococcal meningitis and cerebral cryptococcomas, cryptococcemia or disseminated cryptococcal infections, mucormycosis due to the susceptible stains of mucor, rhizopus, and absida. It is a second line or alternative treatment option for invasive aspergillosis because now we have potent azoles such as voriconazole, which is the first line. Moderately severe and severe pulmonary and extrapulmonary blastomycosis. Here again, mild infections will be treated by the other safer antifungals. Candidiasis. Now, candidiasis also mild infections, moderate infections, which are not life-threatening. We can still go with echinocandidins such as capsofungin, micafungin, but in certain conditions, it is still considered as a first line when there is very life-threatening infections, especially neonatal invasive candidiasis or CNS infections, disseminated candidiasis, candida endocarditis, candida suppurative thrombophlebitis, osteomyelitis, septic arthritis, candidemia in adults, CNS candidiasis. The rest of them, it is generally an alternative treatment or second line, that is candida cystitis or pyelonephritis, esophageal candidiasis, candida chorioretinitis. When there is a candida vitritis, with the systemic therapy, intravitreal injection of amphotericin can be added. Coccidioidomycosis, pulmonary and extrapulmonary, it is again, it could be the second line of treatment, but it is considered as very effective, especially for meningitis. Histoplasmosis, again, when there is severe acute and pulmonary histoplasmosis or progressive disseminated infection. Sporotrichosis, again, it is a second line, but life-threatening, severe pulmonary and extrapulmonary disease, including meningitis. So what it tells us is the spectrum of activity is very large. The point is that there are alternative safe medication, but when there is a life-threatening infection, you can go to amphotericin for almost any fungal infection. We have had some cases of rare fungal infections. We had a case of chromoblastomycosis where the patient had disseminated chromoblastomycosis, including a cerebral abscess, initially treated with voriconazole. Then after surgery, we actually treated the patient with amphotericin B and responded well. So for most life-threatening infection, despite the fungus, it does have a good spectrum of activity. The other infections that it has been treated, amphotericin has been used, is visceral and mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. Although the antimonal compounds such as sodium stibogluconate were initially considered first line, there's a lot of resistance to these antibiotics, especially in India, and that is why amphotericin is now used. And primary amoebic meningoencephalitis also, it has been tried. Coming to the pharmacokinetics, now the name amphotericin comes because it has the amphipathic and amphoteric nature. If you can see here, it has got a hydrophilic region and a hydrophobic region. So this is important because this binds to the sterols and this binds to the phospholipid areas. And also it can act as a weak acid and weak base, that is amphoteric, and it has a very high molecular weight. So it is not soluble. So that is why we have amphotericin B deoxycholate. Now deoxycholate is a bile salt detergent, and this is what is used to solubilize the amphotericin. And as you know, today we have a lot of lipid formulation where we use a variety of lipid carriers to make the amphotericin B soluble. When there is an initial infusion of amphotericin, there is a peak that is attained in the plasma of 0.5 to 2 micrograms per ml. After that, there is a rapid distribution. Because of the distribution, the plasma concentration drops to 0.5 microgram per ml. And it can be detected in pleural fluid, peritoneal fluid, synovial fluid, and also aqueous humor. Although the penetration in the CSF is only 2.5%, it still does have a good activity against infection in the CNS, that is meningitis. So it is fungistatic or fungicidal depending upon the concentration. At a lower concentration, at a lower pH, it is fungistatic. When a good concentration is achieved, it can be fungicidal, and its activity is maximal over the pH range of 6 to 7.5. It has got an initial plasma life of about 24 hours, and it is highly bound to plasma proteins, and hence it is poorly dialysable, and it accumulates in the liver, spleen, kidneys, lungs, and bone. That is why it is excreted very slowly. So even if you stop amphotericin, it is eliminated over a half-life of about 15 days, and even after 7 weeks of discontinuing treatment, you can detect it in the urine. Now, this is important. That is because they have found that even if we have given amphotericin for a few days and we have had to stop because of nephrotoxic side effect, the fungicidal effect of amphotericin is still there. So that is the reason that this is important to know. So the cumulative urine output over 7 days, there's only 40% of the drug that is excreted out. So it is a very slow excretion. Now the dosing, it is for rare invasive fungal infection, and for that reason there have not been big randomized control trials to identify the exact dose that is required. So it is generally individualized, and the definitive treatment duration is not known for most of the infection. But for the infections that we commonly give and where it is the gold standard, that is in cryptococcal meningitis and disseminated cryptococcal infection, it is given at a dose of 0.7 to 1 milligram per kg. In cerebral cryptococcomas, it is given up to 6 weeks, whereas for meningitis, it is given for the first 2 weeks, followed by oral fluconazole. In mucormycosis, the typical dose is as to high as 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg per day. It is a higher dose than for cryptococcal meningitis. And the total dose is quite high. It is up to 3 grams. So for most infections, we give a dose of 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg per day. And for certain infections such as invasive candidiasis or candidal endocarditis or candidal CNS infection, the treatment can go on till there is complete resolution. It can be continued up to 10 to 12 months also, but most of these patients are quite sick and do not really do well and have a higher mortality. So complete eradication is difficult, especially considering the side effects of amphotericin. Doses exceeding 1 milligram per kg is for mucormycosis and coccidioidomycosis. So the upper limit is 1.5 milligram per kg per day, and this should not be exceeded. So how do we start the treatment? So initially, we can give it at a dose of 0.25 milligram per kg. There is a lot of controversy about this, especially when we have a life-threatening infection. Going up slowly on the dose, as I told you, it is fungicidal only when the optimum concentration is reached. So they don't really advise gradually titrating upwards. But in non-threatening infections, you can start it at a lower dose and titrate it upwards over 3 to 4 days. In severe and progressive fungal infection, you can start it at a higher dose. So in patients with impaired cardiac renal functions or who have had a reaction to the test dose, you can even start at smaller doses of 5 to 10 milligram. Even if there's a reaction, you can still give a trial of the drug at lower doses, and as they tolerate, you can increase it slowly by 5 to 10 milligram to reach the daily dose of 0.5 to 0.7 milligram per kg. In case we have had to interrupt the therapy due to any reason, again, when we start, a lower starting dose should be administered if there is a gap of more than 1 week. So how do we administer amphotericin practically? So most of it, if you remember the first picture that I showed you, it is a powder, and it is usually a yellowish or orange powder. It's a sterile powder that contains, it's a lyophilized powder, it is freeze dried, and it contains 50 milligram of amphotericin B. And to that is added sodium deoxycholate, which is a bile salt detergent, to make it soluble. And it is buffered with sodium phosphate. So initially you have to add 10 ml of sterile water. With this, we get a concentration of 5 milligram per ml. Shake the vial immediately until the solution is clear. Now the infusion solution you need to make at 0.1 milligram per ml. For this, you have to dilute with about 50 ml of 5% dextrose, which should have a pH of about 4.2. If the pH is below, so actually what they advise is that the pH of the each of these dextrose solution needs to be determined. Now the dextrose that we get commercially has a pH of 3.5 to 6, an average pH of about 4, because that's probably the reason why we don't do this routinely, nor is this easily done. But they've said that in case the pH is below 4.2, then you have to add 1 to 2 ml of a phosphate buffer that is available commercially before it is used to dilute the concentrated solution of amphotericin. The buffer should be sterilized in case we need to add that. Now what we need to remember that this is an antifungal, it has no antibacterial activity. Because of this, anytime you're injecting anything into the infusion solution, strict asepsis needs to be observed since there is no bacteriostatic agent. Do not reconstitute with saline solutions. It is a very unstable compound. It precipitates very easily. So the reason why we cannot add saline or any other diluents that are being recommended is that it will be ineffective if it precipitates. So you have to make sure that it is completely shaken, it is clear, reconstitute only with 5% dextrose. The two substances that could be, two drugs that could be added are sodium heparin or hydrocortisone, which does not affect its stability. Why we need to add this, I will tell you later. So how do we administer? Now, once we have diluted the amphotericin, you give a test dose. Now, test dose, you can add 1 milligram of the diluted solution in 20 ml of 5% dextrose and administer over 20 to 30 minutes. So that's a very slow administration. So watch for the patient's temperature, pulse, respiratory rate, blood pressure. And it should be recorded up to 30 minutes. Now, initial study said that you have to even record it up to 4 hours. In case the patient does not have any infusion reaction, then you can start the full dose of amphotericin B. So amphotericin B, when you give the injection, IV injection, it should be protected from light. I told you it is very unstable and can precipitate. Recent studies have found that if there is an immediate reconstitution up to 24 hours, it will not precipitate. Hence, it may not require a complete protection from light, but this is what we generally follow. An intravenous infusion should be given slowly, approximately 2 to 6 hours. What we follow is about 4 to 6 hours. So it is unstable in acid media, sensitive to light, and requires a storage between 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. Now, after the initial reconstitution, it may be stored in the dark at room temperatures for about a day or refrigerator for about a week. But once you completely dilute it, that once you get a solution of 0.1 milligram per ml, it should be used promptly and you cannot store it. Otherwise, you'll have to discard it. So what are the other routes of administration? This is not what we generally do, but I'm just covering this because it has been widely used, especially earlier when we had only amphotericin B. So one is bladder irrigation. Now, Candiduria due to fluconazole resistant species, they have tried a local irrigation of amphotericin where they have instead about 50 milligram is added to 1000 ml of sterile water. And treatment can either be by continuous irrigation or intermittent installation, 3 to 4 times a day with a dwell time of at least 2 hours. Oral route. So the oral route, the conventional amphotericin B or the earlier compounds are not absorbed orally, and it can be given only for the prevention of fungal colonization of the GI tract. So when there is a persistent esophageal candidiasis or it's not responding to treatment, they've used amphotericin B lozenges and mouthwashes, and this responds well. For meningitis, direct instillation into the CSF can be given along with systemic therapy. You can either give it by intrathecal, intracisternal, or intraventricular routes. So dosage is 0.05 to 0.5 milligram per day. So it is given in about 5 ml of 10% glucose, and to this we have to add 5 to 25 milligram of hydrocortisone to prevent the side effects such as headache, fever, nausea, and arachnoiditis. So the dosage is gradually increased till tolerated, and once there is good response, it can be gradually reduced to the lowest dose required and then stopped. Intraocular instillation for fungal endophthalmitis, intravitreal administration may be a useful adjunct. Nebulized amphotericin B has been used to eradicate fungal colonization of the respiratory tract. They've also tried intraperitoneal route, especially for patients who are on dialysis. But what happens is these patients generally develop adhesions, and because of which the entire catheter needs to be removed. So it is generally not used nowadays. So in CKD, chronic kidney disease, we know that amphotericin is one of the drugs that have a high incidence of nephrotoxicity, but still with the creatinine clearance of more than 10, it can be given at the lowest required dose. When the creatinine clearance of 10 ml per minute, it's less than 10 ml per minute, it can be given at 0.5 to 0.7 milligram per kg IV, either 24 hours or once in 48 hours with very strict monitoring of the creatinine. In case a patient is undergoing hemodialysis, 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg after the dialysis session, or in continuous renal replacement therapy, 0.5 to 1 milligram per kg per day. So in pregnancy, it is category B, which means that it can be given, although we do not have animal or human studies to identify the risk versus the benefit. But this is a drug that is given for life-threatening invasive infection, and hence it needs to be given for the optimum treatment of the mother. And in most of the case reports and case series where amphotericin has been given in pregnancy, it has not resulted in any major adverse effects in the fetus. The lactation, however, the decision should be individualized to stop breastfeeding before starting the amphotericin. The only contraindication per se for amphotericin is a hypersensitivity reaction. So any allergic reaction, it could be either to amphotericin or to any of the carriers, including deoxycholate or the lipid carriers. And it has been found that if there's anaphylaxis, it predisposes to reactions to other formulations, and it may not be advised to try the other formulations. The adverse effects, now infusion reactions. So these are very common and what we generally see. That is why the test dose is important to identify. And the infusion reactions will happen 1 to 3 hours after starting the IV infusion. It can result with fever, chills and hypotension, severe anorexia, nausea and vomiting, headache and tachypnea. So these reactions are usually severe in the first few doses. That is why if there is not an immediate requirement to give a very high dose, we can start with giving lower doses and slowly titrate upwards till the tolerance is developed for the infusion reactions. One of the ways to prevent this that we find very useful is to give one of these measures, a simple acetaminophen, which is 650 to 1000 milligram can be given, or we can give antihistaminics such as diphenhydramine or promethazine, or NSAIDs, they have tried drugs like ibuprofen or prochlorperazine can be given as a prevention for the infusion reaction. A rapid intravenous infusion has been associated with hypotension, hypokalemia, arrhythmias, and shock and should therefore be avoided. Now, phlebitis is a complication that primarily occurs in patients receiving infusions via small peripheral vein. So I think generally this is one of the common problems that we see in the ward, that by the second or third day, the sisters are complaining that they need to change the line or they're not able to get IV access. So generally what we use is a central line for amphotericin infusion. But they have said that we can add hydrocortisone, that is 25 milligram, or heparin, 500 to 1000 units to the infusion itself, and this will reduce the incidence of phlebitis. Another way to reduce this, to avoid the final infusion concentration of more than 0.1 milligram per ml, and to give a slow infusion rate. So amphotericin nephrotoxicity. So this is one of the most common side effects, and this is what we worry about, and we need to closely monitor. And this is one of the limiting factors in amphotericin we use, and this is the reason why we have newer drugs today. So the side effects that it can cause, the renal side effects are impaired renal function. There can be an elevation in the creatinine, urinary potassium wasting and hypokalemia, urinary magnesium wasting and hypomagnesemia, metabolic acidosis due to renal tubular acidosis, and nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. So why does this really happen? So initial data, the early studies as early as 1980s or 1970s, they would quote up to 80% patients develop amphotericin B induced renal dysfunction. But if you see the latest data where they have reviewed patients, one study of about 494 patients, only 28% developed and 50% increase in serum creatinine, and 27%, another study there was 27% in 643 patients. So the reason is because they have identified this, we have identified how to prevent it, how to monitor more closely, and how to avoid this side effect. So the risk of nephrotoxicity is higher when you're using other nephrotoxic drugs, when a patient has a chronic kidney disease in the background, when you're using a higher dose, especially for cryptococcal meningitis, mucormycosis, or coccidioidal meningitis. And deoxycholate itself can cause tubular injury in addition. So why does it really happen? They have identified two mechanisms. One is that there is an efferent arteriolar vasoconstriction due to amphotericin. Now what happens is, I told you there is a lot of cholesterol cells, and amphotericin B, unlike the lipid formulations, has an uptake and more in the LDL cells, which are very rich in the renal system, and that is why there is an increased uptake of amphotericin B here and more side effects. This efferent arteriolar vasoconstriction happens, and also there is a direct damage to the distal tubules, and there's a loss of sodium, potassium, and magnesium. With the loss of potassium and magnesium, it results in hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia. And because of this, the hydrogen ions also that are secreted move back into the from the lumen, move back into the cells, and this results in the renal tubular acidosis because of this loss of acid-base balance here. And when this distal tubular damage occurs, this is called as a tubuloglomerular feedback. It results in an increased constriction of the efferent arterioles, and this causes an increase in the serum creatinine. So this is the reason for the nephrotoxicity. It also causes resistance to the antidiuretic hormone, which leads to like a nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. How do you prevent it? So a lot of animal studies have found, and also preclinical studies have found that salt loading. So a few studies, they have tried loading with sodium. They have given oral sodium plus IV sodium plus certain drugs such as ticarcillin sodium, which has got a higher content of sodium in it. So what it does is, with the higher sodium content and the hydration, this efferent arteriolar vasoconstriction is overcome, and because of this, this tubuloglomerular feedback is reduced, and this reduces the nephrotoxicity. So salt loading and hydration. So they have tried up to about 1 liter of isotonic saline. So that is the reason that why we try and give them isotonic saline up to 500 ml either before or after, or just before the infusion. The other ways to prevent is avoid use of other nephrotoxic drugs. They have tried intermittent therapy, that is an alternative day therapy, although this is not recommended in indications where we want aggressive therapy for the patient. And it is also reversible. You can interrupt the therapy for a few days and wait for the creatinine to stabilize or improve. If there is a cumulative dose of more than 5 grams, it can result in permanent damage. And of course, now we have the lipid formulations, which will help to prevent this nephrotoxicity. The other side effects are, it can cause varied side effects in almost every organ. So I'm just going to brush through most of them. So cardiopulmonary, it can cause cardiac arrest, shock, and cardiac failure, pulmonary edema, arrhythmias including ventricular fibrillation. So this is generally seen, especially if there is a rapid infusion, and that is the reason why the infusion rate should be slow. It can also cause hypertension in a few patients or a hypersensitive pneumonitis. The skin changes, it can lead to a maculopapular rash and pruritus, skin exfoliation, toxic epidermal necrolysis, or even a Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Gastrointestinal, it can cause hepatitis or an acute liver failure, hemorrhagic gastroenteritis. It can cause agranulocytosis, thrombocytopenia, leukocytosis with eosinophilia, and a reversible normocytic normochromic anemia, normocytic anemia. This is due to the suppression of erythropoietin. So most of these are reversible on stopping treatment. Coming to neurological complications, amphotericin per se can cause convulsions. It can lead to hearing loss, tinnitus, and transient vertigo. It can cause visual impairment and diplopia, or even a peripheral neuropathy. There's one interesting side effect that has been identified, especially in the early days. It is a demyelinating encephalopathy, and this has been identified in a certain subset of patients. These patients have generally hematological patients who have either received a bone marrow transplantation with a total body irradiation or who are receiving cyclosporin. Now, this was first identified with a compound called amphotericin methyl ester, which is a semi-synthetic derivative. Now, this is a very soluble derivative, and that is the reason why it probably crossed the CSF barrier and blood-brain barrier, and there was a first identification of about 14 cases where they did post-mortem studies and identified leukoencephalopathy when these patients, and this drug was abandoned. In 1992, there were 2 cases of fatal leukoencephalopathy identified in patients receiving amphotericin B, and both had received cranial irradiation, and they developed a subacutely evolving neurological disorder characterized by personality change and confusion, leading to akinetic mutism. So this was the MRI that was done in 1992. That is the reason it is like this. This was the only image I could get. So you can see this white matter hyperintensity that is seen, bilateral, symmetrical, like a toxic leukoencephalopathy. So amphotericin B is considered as one of the drugs responsible for toxic leukoencephalopathy. However, this is very rare. There are very few, a handful of case reports, and that too from the early 90s. And in these 2 patients, they found that on the post-mortem, there was a non-inflammatory leukoencephalopathy with astrogliosis and demyelination and infiltration by foamy macrophages. So they hypothesized that probably the irradiation increases the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, and that is why amphotericin B could cause this side effect in these patients. And therefore, it is best avoidable in these patients who are on cyclosporin and who have received irradiation. Some important drug interactions to remember is any drugs that are nephrotoxic, including many anti-neoplastic agents. So most patients with invasive fungal infections are either immunosuppressed or cancer patients on treatment. So that is why it is important. Corticosteroids, it potentiates hypokalemia. Cyclosporin A increases nephrotoxicity. Digitalis may induce hypokalemia and potentiate digitalis toxicity. Flucytosine. So this is important because we give amphotericin in combination with flucytosine. So it can exacerbate the toxicity of flucytosine by increasing its uptake or impairing its excretion. The other point is fluconazole, imidazole such as fluconazole. Now how they act is that they inhibit ergosterol synthesis. So if they inhibit ergosterol synthesis, amphotericin B cannot really act at the ergosterol site. So there is a theoretical antagonism. However, the clinical significance has not been determined, but generally we avoid combining amphotericin and fluconazole. When there is a leukocyte transfusion with amphotericin, it has led to an increased incidence of acute pulmonary toxicity. Any skeletal muscle relaxants, it can exacerbate the effect due to hypokalemia. Given along with zidovudin, there is an increased incidence of myelotoxicity and nephrotoxicity. Now, patient monitoring, when we start the patient on amphotericin, so first, importantly, you have to monitor clinically for the infusion-related reactions during and following each administration. The measurement of renal functions should be done daily during initiation of therapy up to 2 weeks and at least weekly thereafter. And there is no clear-cut guideline as to when we need to stop, but if there is an increase in creatinine more than 2.5 milligram per deciliter or a 50% increase in the serum creatinine from baseline, it is best to stop or to substitute amphotericin B. Initially, the electrolytes have to be checked daily, including potassium and magnesium, and after that, if it is stable and is not changed, if it remains normal, you can do it weekly after that. If the patient has any clinical signs of hypokalemia, important to obtain potassium concentrations immediately. Complete blood count should be measured weekly. Liver function tests are not considered important to be monitored because the hepatic dysfunction is not very common. However, if there are any clinical signs, it needs to be checked immediately. Now coming to lipid formulations, so we have seen that amphotericin B has a very narrow therapeutic index and it has severe adverse side effects. And because of this, for several years, they have tried to find safer formulations, synthetic formulations, which have not, or oral formulations, which have not been very successful. So one of the important breakthroughs for amphotericin B is using lipid formulations where they have used other lipid carriers which has reduced the adverse effects of amphotericin. So they have found that these have a similar therapeutic efficacy but at much higher doses. Now what this lipid vehicle does is that it allows a very controlled release of the drug to the fungal cells and prevents its interaction with the membrane cholesterol of the host cells, and that is why the cholesterol binding is reduced and the side effects come down. And it is released at the target site. That is because amphotericin B has a higher affinity for ergosterol. So it dissociates from the lipid carrier and binds to the ergosterol of the fungus specifically. And also there are presence of lipases around this area from the fungal cells itself, which help to break down this lipid carriers and release the amphotericin B. So what we have available today is liposomal amphotericin B lipid complex, and amphotericin B cholesterol sulfate complex, that is amphotericin B colloidal dispersion. I'll be just briefly talking about the other two. We will just focus on liposomal amphotericin B because that is what we commonly use and is commonly available. So this is how they have intercalated. These are amphotericin B molecules intercalated in a phospholipid bilayer, and it has alpha tocopherol, cholesterol, phosphatidylglycerol, phosphatidylcholine as carriers. So this is a unilamellar liposome, that is ambisome, that is amphotericin, liposomal amphotericin, and that is the ABCD, that is amphotericin B colloidal dispersion, is a disc-like structure, and it's a ribbon-like structure in amphotericin B lipid complex. So we have the carrier lipids which are different: phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylglycerine. Here it is cholesterol sulfate. So the thing about ABLC and ABCD is that it is rapidly taken up by the reticuloendothelial cells. So it has very lower serum concentration, and just like amphotericin B, it has a prolonged elimination half-life. Whereas here, liposomal amphotericin B has a lower volume of distribution and higher serum concentration, but it is within a liposome. That is why there is not much of toxicity, and when it encounters the fungal cells, it is rapidly released. That is why this has a shorter elimination half-life. So the dosing is not studied well, but in randomized trials, but the doses that are generally used is 3 to 5 milligram per kg per day for liposomal amphotericin B and up to 6 milligram per kg for cryptococcal meningitis. For lipid complex, it is 5 milligram per kg. For cholesterol sulfate, 3 to 4 milligram per kg. They have tried doses as high as 10 milligram per kg for liposomal amphotericin B, but especially for very severe mucormycosis or coccidioidomeningitis or cryptococcal meningitis. But they found that there is not much improvement in the efficacy compared to the increase in the risk for nephrotoxicity. So administration of liposomal amphotericin, this again is a 50 milligram vial. So you add 12 ml here of sterile water, and you get a concentration of 4 milligram per ml, and then it is diluted again with 5% dextrose only to a higher concentration. Here you can concentrate it to 1 to 2 milligram per ml, whereas amphotericin B deoxycholate is 0.1 milligram per ml. And this infusion can be given within 2 hours. After a couple of days, if the patient is tolerating well, you can even reduce it to 60 minutes. And here this can be stored, so storage is also not too much of a problem and can be stored up to 25 degrees Celsius temperatures. But if it is reconstituted, it has to be stored at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. And once it is diluted, within 6 hours, it needs to be used. So when we say that the lipid complexes have less side effects, it doesn't mean they do not have side effects at all. And in a meta-analysis of randomized trials, they found that nephrotoxicity with liposomal amphotericin was about 15% compared to conventional, which was about 33%. And even with the amphotericin B deoxycholate, with the ABCD, they found that the response rate was similar as conventional amphotericin, but nephrotoxicity was 25% versus 49% in amphotericin, the conventional amphotericin. However, it almost had a higher rate of infusion-related toxicity with ABCD. So the reasons for the less amount of toxicity with lipid formulation is, one is that there is a larger size of the lipid formulation. Secondly, it does not stimulate the inflammatory mediators as much as conventional amphotericin B. So that is why also there is lesser amount of side effects. Thirdly, it is rapidly taken up by the reticuloendothelial system, and that is why the release into the host cells is reduced. But there is one side effect that we need to be aware of with liposomal amphotericin, and that is although the infusion-related reaction per se is less with liposomal amphotericin, there is one group of infusion reaction that can occur, that is a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction. Now, this is a complement activation-related pseudo-allergy called CARPA. So here what happens is there's a complement activation, because of which there's a mast cell and basophil secretory response. And within 5 minutes of the infusion, the patients can complain just like an anaphylactic reaction, chest pain, dyspnea, hypoxia, abdominal pain, flushing, and urticaria. So the treatment has to be immediately stopped and given antihistaminics. They respond well to diphenhydramines. And once the patient has this reaction, it may be exacerbated even when switching to another formulation. So, although the lipid formulation have a better safety profile, amphotericin B has been around for a long time, since 1950, and it was without any randomized trials. Since it was so potent against life-threatening infections, it is still considered as a gold standard of treatment. Now, there's a lot of talk in the scientific community to replace amphotericin B with lipid formulations, but although we have increasing data about the efficacy and safety, amphotericin B is still the first line of treatment, especially for cryptococcal meningitis and mucormycosis, while lipid formulation have been mentioned as alternative treatments or second line treatments when conventional amphotericin is not tolerated. In addition, we have a lot of safer, newer antifungals with which are potent, such as the echinocandins and the more potent azoles. So, considering the cost of lipid formulations, these are not really considered as first line of treatment even today. Although for patients who develop renal dysfunction, there's concurrent use of nephrotoxic drugs, or who do not tolerate amphotericin B, patients respond very well to lipid formulations. So the cost of the lipid formulation, that is the liposomal amphotericin, that is Ambisome, which is the initial brand, is about 5,000 to 4,500 to 5,000. It was initially being sold at a cost of 7,000, but right now we have multiple Indian brands at varying costs. That's why I've not put it up, 3,000 to 4,000 per vial. That is for 50 milligram, and this we need to give at 3 to 4 milligram per kg. But the daily cost itself is about 10 to 15,000 into 2 weeks for cryptococcal meningitis, or several 3 to 4 months for other infections. So the overall cost works very high, whereas amphotericin, conventional amphotericin costs about 275 to 300 rupees per vial. However, if you have to consider the monitoring cost, the cost that is incurred due to nephrotoxicity, the possible need for dialysis, lipid formulations definitely have an advantage. So these are my references. Thank you. This presentation will be uploaded on this website as well as on the YouTube channel.